Hi, welcome to part 3 on our segment related to Byzantine art. What you're looking at is an image. It's one of thousands of important Byzantine images, books, and documents preserved at St. Catherine's Monastery in Mount Sinai in Egypt, which you have a picture of over here to your left. It's a remarkable encaustic icon painting of the Virgin, or Theotokos, and child between the saints Theodore and George. So icon is Greek for image or painting, and encaustic is a painting technique that uses wax as a medium to carry the color. The icon shows the Virgin and Child flanked by two soldier saints, Saint Theodore to the left and Saint George at the right. Above these are two angels who gaze upward to the hand of God, from which light emanates, falling on the Virgin. The painter selectively used the classicizing style inherent in Rome. I know it doesn't seem like it, but when we look at this compared to, say, the mosaics of Justinian and Theodora, I think you can see a little bit more of classical features. The faces are modeled slightly. We see some convincing modeling in the heads of the angels. Note the little depiction of muscles in their necks. um, and the ease with which their heads turn almost 3/4. So they're looking up, and there is a slight sense of illusion, although it definitely is very Byzantine in many characteristics. Um, the space appears at first compressed, almost flat at our first encounter, yet we find some spatial recession. First in the throes of the Virgin, where we glimpse part of the right side and shadow cast by the throne. I don't know if you can see that here. Um, we also see a receding armrest as well as a projecting footrest. The Virgin, with a slight twist of her body, sits comfortably on the throne, leaning her body left towards the edge of the throne. The Child sits on her ample lap as the mother supports him with both hands. And we see the left knee of the Virgin beneath convincing drapery, whose folds fall sort of between her legs. Again, this is what your book and some other videos have pointed out. Um, and I don't want you to get confused. It's definitely Byzantine, but it's slightly, there is, again, classical arts lying around. It hasn't disappeared, and so there are some classical influences in this Byzantine work. Top of the painting, there is, some sort of architectural feature that turns and recedes at the heads of the angel. You can kind of see it right here. And the architecture helps to create a closed off space around the holy scene. We're going to talk a little bit more about the symbolism and what icons were actually used for. Here's a close-up of it. So Byzantine icons, such as this one, which depicts the Virgin and Child with saints and angels, were used as an aid for meditation and prayer. Icons were designed to foster an intimate connection between the worshiper and the holy personages depicted. Within Byzantium, this intense devotion related to images was extremely controversial. The Virgin and Child with saints and angels icon would have been used by Christian worshippers in the Byzantine world as an aid for meditation and prayer. Many believed that such icons served as intermediaries between worshippers and the holy personages depicted on the painted wood surface. Honor showed to the images were believed to transfer directly to its spiritual prototype. Candles were often lit in front of icons, which were typically displayed in churches on monasteries and occasionally in private homes. Worshippers often touched or kissed the icons, making the use of these religious artworks highly sensory and personal. So church doctrine regarding the veneration of icons was ambivalent. Christianity inherited from Judaism an uneasiness with the power of religious images that was rooted in the Mosaic prohibition of graven images, Exodus 24, the lingering effects of the early persecution of Christians because of their refusal um, to venerate images of Roman emperors also contributed to this anxiety. The rulers of Byzantium took different stances about the practice of using icons in prayer. In the 8th century, for example, the veneration of icons sparked a major controversy in the Eastern Church. And in 726, the Emperor Leo III launched a campaign of iconoclasm, image breaking, banning the use of icons in Christian worship, and ordering the destruction of devotional images. Those who'd adhere to this line of thinking were called iconoclasts. Historians have connected iconoclasm to political motivation as well as to theological arguments. Many believe that iconoclasm represented an attempt on the part of the emperor to wrench power from the monasteries that produced the icons. Because of the wave of iconoclasm, icons created before 1843 are rare. This example survived only because Mount Sinai, where it was held and probably produced at the monastery of St. Catherine, was no longer part of the Byzantine Empire during the periods of the iconoclasm. So, again, to kind of talk about the difference between classical art and Byzantine art and sort of the function of the difference, again, I want you to, even though this has some classical elements to it, Byzantine and Christian art function in a different way than classical Greco-Roman art did, which was more of a direct observation of nature. So the composition, when we look at it, displays a spatial ambiguity that places the scene in a world that operates differently from our world. So there's this assumption that heaven, doesn't have physics and gravity, and it doesn't exist. You know, people, divine people don't exist in the way that we exist in the physical world. Reminiscent of the spatial ambiguity of the earlier ivory panel with Archangel that you can see here. We looked at the very beginning of this subunit. The ambiguity allows the scene to partake of the viewer's world, but also separates the scene from the normal world. So it's almost like these icon or these paintings are sort of these windows into this heavenly world. New in our icon is what we might call a hierarchy of bodies. Theodore and George stand erect, feet on the ground, and gaze directly at the viewer with these very large passive eyes. So they do have, Byzantine looking faces as kind of almond eyes and thin noses. While looking at us, they show no recognition of the viewer and appear ready to receive something from us. So, again, something about the stare and the way the figures aren't confronting the viewer maybe allows for the viewer to feel more intimate and, able to sort of connect with this world and these divine figures. The saints are slightly animated by the lifting of a heel on each, as though they are slowly about to step forward to us. It's very, very subtle. The Virgin averts her gaze and does not make eye contact with the viewer. The ethereal angels concentrate on this hand above. I know it's hard to see. The light tone of the angels, and especially the slightly transparent rendering of their halos, gives the two an otherworldly appearance. Here is a close-up detail. This one is a little better, but here I think you can really see what I was talking about earlier in some of the sort of classical, the modeling. So they're not completely flat and abstract, and see it's like this little indication of the muscle in his neck. She definitely has some shading here where this part of her face is darker and there's a highlight over here. And then here with this architectural, it's this kind of receding or attempt to recede a little bit into space. So the space isn't as compressed. Oops. Um, But again, it is very distinctly Byzantine with the flat halos and again these kind of Byzantine faces and slender bodies. Um, so again, this icon was painted in encaustic on wood panel. Although little is known about the process of painting icons in the early Byzantine period, art historians believe that these panels were probably blessed before being painted on. So again, when we look at these, there is sort of a slight depiction of some space, some illusion and modeling to the faces. But again, when we look closely, especially with the two figures of the saints, their bodies are definitely more stylized. It really is harder to get a sense of the body underneath. Um, and, another feature is this patterning of the textiles. That's something that we saw with the image of Theodora, the beautiful dresses. But patterning again, that has a tendency to flatten the space, and we see that with that being sort of focused on in the robes of the the two saints. And again, there's stairs. With a lot of Byzantine depictions of humans, they seem to kind of stare blankly, and they do. They seem frozen in time. And again, this is sort of that concept of trying to communicate a world that doesn't operate like our world, that it's a heavenly supernatural world, that people float and things operate differently. So this piece is interesting, I think, to art historians because of this, this obvious Byzantine style, but obviously these very subtle, and I want to emphasize the word subtle, allusions to sort of classical features. One thing that intrigues art historians is when we look closely at the face of the Virgin, one of her eyes is slightly bigger than the other. Um, and so, you know, the artist probably did this purposefully to animate her face and sort of enhancing the sensation of the immediacy desired by the Byzantine icon worshiper. So it's an interesting sort of Byzantine icon to look at. Um, as Theotokos, this is the type or of virgin that's being represented here, which is Greek for bearer of God. Jesus's earthly mother was viewed as a powerful, ever forgiving intercessor who could be counted on to appeal to her divine Son for mercy on behalf of devout and repentant worshipers. So this is a type of virgin that we're looking at during the Byzantine period. We're going to see different types of or depictions in art history. So in this icon, she's holding Jesus on her lap in a way that suggests she has become his imperial throne. This is sort of another depiction of the Virgin. This position is often referred to as the seat of wisdom. So those are two terms I do want you to be familiar with. This idea of Theotokos, the bearer of God, and then this sort of depiction of Mary or the Virgin on the throne as the seat of wisdom. The Virgin and Child are flanked by Christian warrior saints, Theodore left and St. George on the right, both legendary figures said to have slain dragons. The warrior saints symbolize the triumph of the church over the evil serpent of paganism. The angels behind them again sort of twist their heads to look heavenward. And again, this is this sort of combination where, here the angels do break that sort of stiffness and frontality of the piece. Um, so I think that's why art historians really like this particular icon because it does sort of break some of the rules of Byzantine art. So this supremely composed picture gives us an unmistakable sense of visual movement inward and upward from the saints to the Virgin, and from the Virgin upward past the angels to the hands of God. So again, thinking about this idea of focus and where our eye goes to, the passive saints seem to stand ready to receive the veneration of the viewer and pass it inward and upward until it reaches the most sacred realm depicted in the picture. We can describe the different appearances as saints who seem to inhabit a world close to our own. They alone have a ground line, which you can sort of see here, and they're closer to our space. And the angels who reside near the hand of God transcend our space. As the eye moves upward, we pass through these zones, the saints standing on the ground and therefore closest to us, and then upward and more ethereal until we reach the holiest zone, that of the hand of God. These zones of holiness suggest a cosmos of the world, earth, and real people through the Virgin, heavenly angels, and finally the hand of God. The viewer who stands before this scene makes this cosmos complete from our earth to our heaven. So the participation of the viewer looking at this piece would really complete this idea of these different this different cosmos. Um, so yeah, Christian art's pretty heavy, it's pretty deep, and when we look at it aesthetically, when we compare it to Greek and Roman art, we're like, oh, why didn't they draw things, realistically or natural? But they definitely conceptually were really thinking and about how to relay these ideas about Christianity, and so the aesthetics are different, and I think very beautiful. So I'm going to stop here for a moment, and go teach a class. I'll be right back. All right, so we're going to be looking at some manuscript painting in our in this section. Um, so the visual arts have undergone numerous changes and transitions from their prehistoric origins to the present. In Europe, artists and patrons of the ancient world loved realistic detail and veracity, and again, I'm talking about Greek and Roman art. Medieval artists and patrons instead valued symbolism and abstraction. Sorry about that, I got interrupted. So medieval artists and patrons instead valued symbolism and abstraction. So that's a good way to think of it. So Greco-Roman artists really loved realism and naturalism, and medieval artists really focus on this idea of symbolism and abstraction. The artists of the Vienna Genesis, which you're looking at right now, is really caught between these two artistic value systems. And so this is a manuscript. This is probably one of the oldest manuscripts in the world. Um, Perhaps working in Syria or in Constantinople in the early 6th century, the artist likely did not know that this book would become the oldest surviving, well-preserved, illustrated biblical book, and an example of an artist caught in a moment of transition. The Vienna Genesis is a fragment of a Greek copy of the Book of Genesis. Books were very luxurious items, and this book was an exceptionally fine example. It was written in silver ink on parchment. It doesn't look silver, I know, but that's because it's tarnished and has turned black. And the parchment has been dyed purple, and the color purple is associated with royalty in the empire. There are 24 surviving folios or pages, and they are thought to have come from a much larger book that included perhaps 192 illustrations on 96 folios. Look at some of the details. Books this old usually do not survive. This work is important in helping us understand early Christian iconography because one of the earliest known narrative, because one of the earliest known narratives it's one of the earliest known narratives illustrating early Bible stories. The text was written in silver and is tarnished black over time. The page has been dyed purple, which signifies again that this was probably a royal commission. Creating a book like this would have been a major undertaking since this would have all been done by hand. At the start of the narrative, we see Jacob walking and leading his family across a bridge over a river. The figure of Jacob is portrayed multiple times in a brown and red tunic. See his wife and daughters on a donkey and his son behind them. Um, After they cross the bridge, we see Jacob wrestling with the angel. He wants the angel to bless him, which the angel does, and from then on, Jacob is known as Israel. This is a very complex narrative for the artist to try to convey with the idea of this transformation. The illustration almost looks like a classical architectural frieze on a Greek temple. If you were to straighten it out, the sort of the bent bridge. So what they're suggesting is that if you actually sort of straighten this out, it almost has this reference to sort of a relief carving on a frieze that you would see on a Greek temple, that sort of format. So there are again some classical references. Um, the artist had to figure out how to fit this linear narrative onto the page's space. So he was very clever about it. The bent, malleable bridge is very characteristic of the scene of a skewed perspective that will become a convention in medieval art. While there are references to classical architecture, the space is not rational and illusionistic. So again, we're sort of caught in this sort of transition. All right, so this is another page from Vienna Genesis. This story is from Genesis 24. Abraham wanted to find a wife for his son Isaac and sent his servant Eliezer to find one from among Abraham's extended family. Um, Eliezer took 10 of Abraham's camels with him and stopped at a well to give them water. Eliezer prayed to God that Isaac's future wife would assist him with watering his camels. Rebecca arrives on the scene and assists Eliezer, who knows that she is the woman for Isaac. This story is about God intervening to ensure a sound marriage for Abraham's son. Let's look at some details. The illustration of this biblical story shows two episodes, which is common in medieval art. We saw that, a similar format with the depiction of Jacob. Rebecca is shown twice as she leaves her town to get water and then assisting, I don't know if this is Eliezer or Ebenezer, at the well with his camels. On the other hand, there are classical um, elements that recall artwork from ancient Greek and Rome. Rebecca walks by a colonnade, which you can see here, which is again a row of columns that recalls the details of classical Greek Roman architecture. Some of Eliezer's camels are shaded. You can sort of see here to emphasize that some are in the front and others are in the back, like right here. So that sense of illusion. The camel on the far right has one of its back legs in shadow to show a spatial relationship. Look at some more details. The figure that most obviously recalls the ancient Greek and Roman world is the reclining nude next to the river towards the left. Let me go back. So we're looking. This figure isn't part of the story of Rebecca and Eliezer, but serves as a personification of the source of the water's well. Representations of rivers and other bodies of water as people were common in the classical world. And you can see here this example of a river god. This is a Greek Roman figure. The figure's sensuality is emphasized by her nudity and reclining pose, typical of Greek and Roman art. This stands in contrast to Rebecca's heavily draped and fully covered body, which would be a sort of a typical convention in early Christian art. So again, this is very much indicative of this sort of transition from the Greco-Roman world to the medieval world. There are also elements of the illustration that recall early Christian art, which is the earliest medieval art. The symbolic representation of the walled city packed with rooftops and buildings that are not represented in a spatially consistent way as typical of medieval art, as is the colonnade in miniature. Medieval artists aren't interested in realistic, consistent representations of space, but were satisfied with the more symbolic representations that we see here. The folds of the clothing are also simplified and reduced. The figures appear to be more cartoon-like than portraits of actual people. Today is a struggle. It is a struggle for us to reconcile the figures of Rebecca, who only reveals her hands and face with the casual nude reclining by the water. The contrast is evidence of a mix of artistic models and sources that were present in the early 6th century. To the artist who illustrated this book, I'm sure that this mix of styles and approaches made perfect sense and represented a cultural transition. Okay, so that's the end of Byzantine art. I'm sorry we couldn't spend more time on it, but we have other stuff to cover. And our next segment is going to be the Hiberno-Saxon, our next subunit in relation to medieval art. So stay tuned.